All right, ready to dive deep? Today, we're tackling the Four Noble Truths, those pillars of Buddhist thought, and we're tailoring this whole thing based on the sources he sent in.
It's like we've got a custom-made map for navigating out of, well, as the Buddha might say, the desert of suffering.
Right. And speaking of suffering, it's a loaded word, but one source I was looking at emphasized it's not about doom and gloom, it's more like clear-eyed observation.
Exactly, like a doctor needing the right diagnosis before they can treat you. One source even used that analogy. It's about facing reality, not like becoming a pessimist.
And this really hit home for me when I was reading that story about Prince Siddhartha, the guy who became the Buddha. He was living it up, completely shielded from hardship, and yet he still encountered suffering. It's like this aha moment the source builds up to, showing us it's not about our circumstances, but something deeper.
It's woven into the fabric of existence, you could say.
Yeah.
And that leads us to the second truth, the why of suffering. It's not just stuff happening to us, but our reactions.
That clinging, that grasping we do, the source had this spot-on analogy trying to catch a reflection in the water. The harder you grip, the more distorted it gets. Ever felt that?
Oh, absolutely, haven't we all? About
Sure.
someone, something. That's the culprit the Buddha called samudaya. Craving at the root of suffering. Not that enjoyment is bad, but it's about noticing when desire becomes that tight, desperate grip.
Which is where the hope comes in, right? Because otherwise, what's the point? Thankfully, that's the third noble truth, Nirodha, the possibility of liberation.
And the source emphasizes this isn't some far-out mystical thing. It's a shift that's possible, a change in how we relate to, well, everything, including ourselves.
There's this really powerful story the source uses to show this about a mother, Kisa Gotami. Her child has died, and she begs the Buddha to bring him back. Instead of magic, he gives her this seemingly impossible task. Find a mustard seed from a home untouched by death.
It's brilliant, really, because of course she can't. And it forces her and us reading it to confront the truth about loss. Not to pretend it doesn't exist, but to change how we relate to that painful reality.
Which is a big part of what Nirodha is about, right? Like, that acceptance, even of the hard stuff, can actually lessen suffering instead of us trying to ignore it.
Exactly. It's not about erasing negative feelings, but transforming them. And the source lays out a path to do just that. The fourth noble truth. Magga, often called the Eightfold Path. Now, before you picture some rigid checklist,
Which I'll admit is totally where my mind went first.
the source is clear this is more like a compass. It guides us towards a life of, greater peace, greater fulfillment. There's even this analogy of a musical instrument, perfectly tuned. Each part is crucial for the overall harmony.
And there are 8 parts, so we won't hit every note right now, but just quickly, so our listeners aren't lost, we're talking, right? Understanding, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. Whew, that's a mouthful.
And the source stresses how interconnected they are. You can't have ethical action if it's based on bad intentions.
Yeah.
Right? That'd be messed up. Each part influences the others.
It's true. And it makes me think, we've gone from this image of wandering a desert to having this map with landmarks and everything. But like with any good map, it's not about just having it.
It's about taking that first step, and then the next one. It's about actually using these truths to navigate our lives, right?
Which for me is what makes this whole deep dive so compelling. It's not just some abstract theory, it's practical. It's like, how do I actually live this stuff? And the source material really delivers.
It really does. One thing I found really interesting was how much Buddhism emphasizes that this isn't about blind faith. It's about examining your own life, the world as it is, and then making choices that line up with what you see.
Absolutely. It's not about like becoming a monk and hiding in a cave. Unless that's your thing, of course. It's about making these principles part of our actual lives.
Exactly. Take, for example, right speech. One source I read really highlighted the power of our words.
Oh, yeah.
How much they can lift someone up or completely tear them down.
It's kind of scary when you really think about it.
It is. And that's where right speech comes in. And it's not just about being nice. It's deeper than that. It's about honesty, kindness, and really, really being aware of the impact our words have.
Which, let's be real, is something a lot of us could use a refresher on, right? Like maybe think twice before hitting send on that heated text message.
Right, exactly. And then you've got right action, where the source emphasizes acting ethically, skillfully in all areas of life.
So like making choices that square with our values. Choices that actually help, not hurt, ourselves and others.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really interesting. The source connects right action to right livelihood. Because if your job forces you to compromise your values all the time.
It's going to be tough to live an ethical life overall. They're linked.
Exactly. The Source actually challenges us to really consider, is my work aligned with these principles, with the Eightfold Path?
Which, yeah, I'll admit, that's a bit of a radical question.
It is.
But it's worth asking, don't you think? Like, if this whole path is about reducing suffering, is what I'm doing for a living actually adding to it instead?
It's a big question. And this is where right effort comes in. Because this kind of transformation, it takes work, conscious choice, especially when we're surrounded by distractions and old habits.
All that stuff that keeps us stuck in those familiar patterns of suffering that the Buddha was talking about. It's like a cycle.
Right. And to illustrate this, the Source uses this great analogy of a gardener tending their garden. Right. Effort is like that constant tending. Patience, diligence, weeding out the negativity, cultivating the good.
I love that analogy. It's so grounding, but we're human, right? We slip up.
Really?
Which is where I'm guessing mindfulness comes in.
Exactly. Mindfulness is about paying attention, but without judgment. It's about noticing your thoughts, your feelings, your sensations, just as they are.
Instead of getting, like, swept away by them, like that reply all email you regret the second you hit send.
Exactly. Mindfulness gives us that little bit of space, that pause between feeling and reacting. And that space, that's where we can choose differently.
Which leads us to that final piece,
Yeah.
right? Concentration. And this is where it went from, okay, I get it, to how do I actually train my mind for this?
Right. It's not easy. The source I was reading used this analogy of a flickering candle. If you try to force it steady, it just makes it worse. But if it's in a calm environment, it naturally steadies itself.
So are we talking like meditation, mindfulness practices, anything that can help us cultivate that inner stillness?
Exactly. It's how we begin to see things more clearly, to respond with more wisdom instead of just, freaking out.
And even though we've been talking about these Eightfold Path parts separately,
They're all intertwined, yeah, like threads in a tapestry.
Yeah.
Each one supports the others, creates this whole picture of a life lived skillfully.
It's been echoing in my head this whole time. Compassion. It feels like that's like the underlying current running through all Four Noble Truths, don't you think?
Definitely. In fact, one source pointed out how understanding our own suffering can actually make us more compassionate towards others. Kind of counterintuitive, but when you think about it,
it makes sense. Because once you've really come face to face with your own struggles, it's easier to recognize that everyone's fighting their own battle. That feeling of we're all in this together.
And that's where right intention comes in. Because the source was clear that it's not enough to just intellectually grasp these truths. We have to embody them. And that starts with our intentions.
So cultivating kindness, a genuine desire to help, not just going through the motions of being a good person.
Exactly. One source even went so far as to say that without that heart behind it, without the right intention, even perfectly following the Eightfold Path can ring hollow.
Whoa. Which makes you think you could be technically following right speech, but if your intention is to manipulate someone, it's not really right, is it? It's the action and the motivation behind it.
Exactly. True liberation, as the source put it, comes from that alignment. When our actions are flowing from our deepest values, that desire for a more peaceful, more compassionate world.
This whole deep dive has got my brain going. It's making me think. If suffering comes from attachment, right, could some suffering even come from good intentions if we're too attached to the outcome? Is that even possible?
That's a really interesting question. And actually, one source I read touched on this exact idea. It's like when we're so focused on helping someone that we end up enabling behavior that's actually harmful. Our heart's in the right place, but
we end up creating more suffering, both for them and for ourselves. So is it about compassion, but with boundaries? Holding our intentions a little more lightly, being open to things not going exactly how we pictured.
That's the dance, isn't it? The source seemed to suggest that real, true compassion requires both action and non-attachment. We do what we can, but we also accept that we can't control the outcome.
Man, there's so much here, even in just these Four Noble Truths. It's like the source material has given us these incredible tools to navigate, the desert of suffering instead of just wandering around lost.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up, I think the most important takeaway is this: what will you do with these tools? Because this isn't just information. This is a call to action. How will you apply even a little bit of this to your own life, starting today?
Because even the smallest act of kindness, a moment of mindfulness, it creates ripples. It matters. So keep exploring, keep diving deep into yourselves and the world around you. And until next time, take care.